we'll be talking about the transaction management. That will be one of the applications of, you know, Spring AOP as per J. Okay. So now let's see one of the applications of Spring Spring AOP. That is nothing but transaction management. Okay. So transaction management is one of the most important support for the transaction management is one of the most important features which you'll see in Spring. Spring provides transaction management support. Actually, it is declarative transaction management support, which you'll see here. So, declarative transaction management support. Here, you'll find that Spring in Spring you'll find that the transaction management has been standardized. The way we deal with the transactions has been standardized, I can say. Okay. You know what? Here, no matter which API or which framework you're using to deal with data access, whether it is JDBC, whether it is Hibernate, or whether it is JPA, or you got some other ORM frameworks. So no matter which API or framework you're using, you'll find that there is a uniform or standardized transaction management support which is provided here. Okay. Here, you'll find that in order to deal with these transactions, Spring is going to help. Spring AOP is going to help us in this regard. Because when I say transactions, or transaction management code, you know, again, this is one of the cross-cutting concern I can say. That this is one of the cross-cutting concern. Why I'm calling it as cross-cutting concern? Because you'll find that here Uh, this is the common code. Yes, which you'll see across the DOs, right? In most of the DOs you'll be writing the transaction management code. Yes. So again, this is one of the cross-cutting consent code. Now, let me explain you how we can use Spring AOP the transactions. Okay. Yes. Just a second. Just check this diagram. So hope you people are able to view this diagram. Here, let's say we got a target method here. Okay. And to this target method, I want to apply the transaction. Now, transaction management code in terms of AOP, what is it known as? Yes. Transaction management code in terms of AOP, what is it known as? Yes, what are cross-cutting concerns known as? No. What are cross-cutting concerns known as in AOP? In AOP terminology, what are cross-cutting concerns? Advice. That's right. We call them as advisors, right? Each cross-cutting concern is basically an advice. So transaction management code is also one of the advice code. Please remember. Now, to this target method, okay, let's say it contains some business logic. And as part of that business logic, it has to interact with the database also. Okay. Now, here, to this target method, we won't apply the transaction advice. Okay. We won't apply the transaction advice. Okay. So you see, for that, we don't need to develop a transaction advice. So far, if you want to write some advice code, we used to develop the advice. We used to define this advice code, right? We used to write that advice code. And how did we write that? How did we, create the advices? Where did we write the advice code? The AOP, what type of support it provides to write the advice code? Yes. In AOP, how do we write the advice code? Yes. We have interfaces, right? We have advice interfaces like method before, method after, around, method interceptor, which is also known as around advice, and throws advice, right? Here we saw that we can define our own advice classes. We can write the advice code. And there is one more way of writing the advice code. What is it? In the aspect J, we saw a different way of writing the advice code. What was that? Yes, we saw a different way of writing the advice code. Aspect programming using aspects. Very good. That's right. You know what? Here you'll find that you got predefined advice now. Already Spring provides an advice to deal with transaction management. That means you don't need to write the code for transaction management. It is already written. It is already defined. You got an advice. You see the transaction advisor which you're looking at here. This is one of the predefined advices which is provided by the Spring framework. So far we didn't use predefined advice classes. Always we used to define our own advice class. But you will find that here you got predefined advices also. Okay. Yes. Now here, you know what? You'll find that we can also customize the behavior of this predefined advice. That is important. You see custom advisors. What we can do is we can customize the predefined advice code which is provided by Spring Framework. According to your requirements, you got a flexibility to customize that advice code also. Okay. So basically when I say transaction management code, you know what will have commit rollbacks, right? And starting the transactions and transaction timeouts. There will be several things. Now you see here, always advice code is executed by whom? Who will execute this advice code? Who will call this advice code? Who is responsible for that? You people are aware of it, right? Proxies, very good. You see, even it is shown here in the diagram. The proxy will be calling the advice. Okay. So here, the proxy will take the calls on behalf of the target method, and it will check whether there is any transaction advisors configured. If so, it will call the transaction advice, and if there are any customizations done to this transaction advice, then you see that customer transaction advice also will execute, and then the target method will execute here. Okay, you see that transaction advice code, it executes before the target method starts execution, and even after the target method finishes execution. And you see again the control will go back like this to the caller, the return value. So basically, once again, I'm repeating this question: which type of advice, which advice interface are we supposed to use to actually we don't need to implement this advice because already it is predefined. But even though it is predefined, okay, can you people tell me this Spring people have used which type of advice interface to write the transaction management code? The Spring framework people, they have, what do you people think? Which advice interface they might have used? No. To implement the transaction advisor, okay, to write that advice code, transaction advice code, which advice interface they might have used? Method interceptor or around advice. Yes, method interceptor or around advice is used. That's right. Okay. Yes. You know what? Here you'll find that the method interceptor is best suitable for transaction management code, and that is in use. And we are not doing it. Already it is implemented. Okay, already it is implemented. So now all we need to learn is how to use this predefined transaction advice and apply it to our target methods, to our methods. Okay, so that is what we need to learn and we need to understand here. Okay, yes, let's do that. Let's learn how to apply this transaction advice. Okay, so first and foremost thing here, okay, we'll go back to this application. You know, the transaction advice, the way you apply it to the DOs or whatever the target methods you got, it will be same no matter whether you're using JDBC, Hibernate, JPA, whatever it is. But there will be slight difference in the configuration. I'll show you what is that. I think already somewhere in our application we have used Hibernate, right? You see here in our application we have used Hibernate. So let's do one thing. Now what I'm going to do is here, we'll try to apply the transaction advice to the DOs. Okay, yes. We got the configuration file here. And you see, we're using Hibernate, right? Yes. Now, you know what I want to do is, here, I want to apply the transaction advice to the DOs which we got, okay, which we're using here. We got Hibernate implementation here, right? You see, I'm trying to start the transaction, commit the transaction and all. You see, I'm writing this code explicitly, but I don't want to do this. See, as of now, we are writing this transaction management code explicitly, right? So if I want to add a product, you know, in Hibernate, you have to start the transaction, you have to commit the transaction. The thing is, here, I don't want to deal with the transactions explicitly. You see, I'll comment this code. Instead, I want to use the advice, predefined advices which are provided by Spring Framework. Okay, so you see, this is the target method now, add product, which is a product DO. Okay, I want to apply the advice for the target method. So what to do? First of all, if you want to deal with transaction management, make sure that you add the schema, transaction schema. Add the transaction namespace or schema. Okay, TX, you'll find this. All of you, please make a note of it. Don't forget to make a note of it. If you don't add this TX or transaction schema, it won't work. Okay, if you don't add transaction schema, it won't work. Yes. Okay, yes. You know what? Here, what is the next thing we have to do? There is one more thing. There is a dependency which I've already added, but let me mention it once again. Whenever you want to deal with transactions, you know what? Here we got a dependency. We got a jar which we need. Yes, this is the Maven dependency, or this is a jar actually, in jar which is needed. Please make a note of it. make sure that you got this jar as well. Okay. What is the artifact ID? Spring TX. All of you please make a note of it. Okay. So now, because we are dealing with AOP, we have to also make sure that you got those dependencies, you see, aspect JRP. Oh, is this enough? No. We need few more dependencies regarding the AOP also. Let's add them. Okay. Yes. So we got AOP project, right? You know what are the dependencies of AOP? Earlier I have mentioned it. So AOP and aspect J for both. I'll add the same set of dependencies here. Let me copy them. See here, you'll find that you need this force CGLib, this file. We just have aspect J here, that's it. Let me add all the five here. What are the five dependencies, Maven dependencies which you need? String AOP, AOP aliens, AOP aspect JRT, aspect JVewer, and CGLib. Why CGLib used? Why CGLib used? Just a minute, please, just a minute. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, CGLib is used for creating proxies. Proxy objects, for proxy object creations, CGLib is used. Okay, internally we don't need to use it explicitly, but yes, proxy objects are created using CGLib. Okay, now you save those details. Sorry. Now what is the next thing you have to do? Yes. So first you have added TX namespace, okay? And then you have added the dependencies which are needed here, right? Next, here, if you want to deal with transactions, make sure that you configure a transaction manager. Make sure that you configure a transaction manager. Hibernate. Transaction manager. Okay. Using Hibernate 4 here. Okay. So, this transaction manager is the bean which is in charge of dealing with the transactions. Okay. So it will be responsible for managing the transactions here. The customizations and all, whatever I did, I said, all will be, uh, it will be taken care by this manager, transaction manager. So what you have to do is you have to configure an ID here. This is not the advice bean. Okay, this is not the transaction advisor. It is just transaction manager, which will be responsible for dealing with the overall transaction management here. Yes. Now, here for the transaction manager, you have to configure the data source details. Data source details. For the transaction manager, the dependencies, the data source. Data source is driver manager data source, which we have configured here. Yes. And here, just a second. Even the session factory, you have to configure it here. Okay. Even you have to configure the session factory. Session factory. These are the two things which you have to configure here. Yes. Now, what is the next thing we have to do? Yes. So the next thing what we have to do is here, we have to configure the details about the advice, for which methods you want to apply the advice and all. But you know what, before that, let's say I want to apply the advice, okay, using annotations. Just add these details. Transaction TX annotation driven. And you have to configure the transaction manager details here. You have to configure the transaction manager details here. What is the transaction manager name? Hibernate transaction manager. So what is this annotation? What it does basically? Why do we use it? Sorry, this XML element here. What it is used? What does this means? Here this annotation, annotation driven. Sorry, this XML element annotation driven. It indicates that you want to apply the transaction advice. You want to apply the transaction advice using annotations. We saw that we can configure the advice details using XML as well as using the annotations, right? Here, as of now, let's say I want to use annotations. So that's the reason why I've added this element. Okay, that's it. Now we are done with this configuration. What to do? First of all, configure the Hibernate transaction manager if you're using Hibernate framework, and make sure that you configure the dependencies like data source details and the session factory which you're using here in this application. So you know why we use session factory. Okay, once let me ask you people, why do we use session factory? Don't disappoint me. Okay, this is early morning for me. Make my day really good by answering a very good question. So why do we use session factory bean? What do we do with this session factory? Your answer should make me satisfied. Okay. Why do we use session factory? Not in this context, in general. Okay, in Hibernate, why do we use session factory? Session factory bean, session factory object, what it does basically, it is used to obtain session. This is used to obtain, the session factory is used to obtain a session object. And why do we use session? Session is the interface or object which is used to interact with the database, right? In Hibernate, if you want to interact with the database, let's say if you want to fetch a record, update a record, query the database, what is needed first thing? What do you need? No matter what type of DB operations you want to perform, whether updating, fetching, you need a session, right? And how do we obtain the session object? Using the session factory itself, okay? So that session factory object, you have to configure it here. Yes, these are the two things which you have to do. First, okay, configure the Hibernate transaction manager. Then add this annotation, TX transaction advice. TX, sorry, annotation driven transaction manager. That's enough. And now, you know what? Here, what I want to do is, I want to apply the transaction advice here. I want to apply the transaction advice. Yes. So how do I do that? Spring has provided special annotations to configure the transaction advice. Spring has provided special annotations to configure the transaction advice. Okay, what is it? This is the annotation. Sorry. Transactional. Okay, you see, when I add this annotation transactional, you got as error, sorry, not error, arrow. This is not an error. What it says, what do I mean by this transactional means? Yes, this indicates that I want this method to execute under the transaction context. That means through this annotation, I'm actually providing, I'm actually configuring an advice. What advice? Transaction advice. Okay, we are configuring a transaction advice here. Yes. Okay, we are configuring a transaction advice. Yeah. Okay, so hope you people got it. So that means to this method, what is the target method now? Which method is the target method? What is the target method here? Add product, right? Add product is a target method. Yes, that's right. That's great. So now we want to apply an advice. What is it? Transaction advice. That means whenever, we want always this method to execute under the transaction context. Okay, we want this method to execute under the transaction context. Always we want to execute this method under transaction context. That is the transaction advice we want to apply. Okay, yes. Now, where is the advice code? That means when I say transaction advice means starting the transaction, committing the transaction. You see, we are not writing it here. Okay, we have commented it. Where is the advice code now? Usually we'll be writing the advice code in the advice classes or in the aspects, right? But where is that advice class or advice code? Where is the advice code? Yes. You people got my question? Hope you people got my question, right? Understood my question. No? So where is the advice code? The question is, I said we won't apply an advice, right, to this method, transactional advice. That means we won't apply transaction advice to this method. So where is the transaction advice? Where is that advice code? Hope now you people understood the question. So where is the transaction advisor? Yes, it's a predefined bean, right? It is a predefined bean and it is part of the Spring framework. Okay, so we don't need to implement it. By default, it is available in Spring framework. Yes. So it's inbuilt, it's predefined. It is provided by the Spring framework itself. You know, you want to see the details about the transaction bean, the transaction advice. You see, just place the cursor over this arrow. You got this arrow, right? This link. Just place the cursor here. Yes. You see, just read these details. It's very important. All of you carefully read these details. You will understand. Yes. Okay. So what is that? Where now? You know what it says? Advice to buy. It is providing some class details here. It says advice to buy. Transaction interceptor is the class name. Invoke is the method. Implements. Okay, it says it is advised by this class, transaction interface, transaction interceptor. So actually this is the transaction advisor. Transaction interceptor class which you're looking at, it is the transaction advice class. You got the transaction advice over there. You got this. Okay. You see, it is clearly, you can clearly understand that actually here this transaction advisor, you can easily understand that here the transaction advisor, it implements method before advice. It implements method interceptor. How can I say that it is implementing method interceptor? Yes. How can I say that it is implementing method interceptor? How I'm saying that it is implementing method interceptor? You know what? Not only the naming convention, but you know, in this interceptor you got a method invoke. Invoke method is there, na? And you see it takes a parameter, method invocation. Yes. You know what? Here, that itself in this invoke method is actually defined in the method interceptor interface itself, which is basically around advice, right? Invoke method is defined in the method interceptor itself. It is around advice. You see the parameter type is method invocation. That itself will provide you the details. Okay, got it? Yes. So this is the predefined transaction advices class which we are using here. Okay, the transaction code is defined, advice code is defined in that class. And you see through this annotation, we are able to wire that advice code which is defined in the transaction interceptor to this method called as add product. Yes. Is it clear for everyone? So hope this is clear, right? Fine. Now I said there is an option to customize this transaction advice. We got an option to customize this advice code. How to do that? We'll see that later. But you see, we'll see whether this transaction advice code really is working or not, really it is working or not. So I think you got a form for this. Oh, there is some error. Let me see once. In the POM file, you got some error. What is the error? Okay, project clean. It is showing an error in the pom.xml file, but you know the problem is it's not highlighted here. Yeah, I got it. You know here, that variable name, it should be hyphen. Sometimes, you know, it is difficult to trace out the errors also. And it is the variable name that's got the problem. String of framework hyphen version. Yeah. Okay, let me check for the form. Which form is that? For the add product. Add product. I think this is the URL. Add product process HTML. Let's see. So when you place a request for this URL, okay, you got a controller associated to it. Add product controller. Yes. So this controller will be using that method add product. Okay. When you submit the form, the controller's method add product process will be invoked and it will be handling the request. Okay. Yes. See, this controller in turn is taking the help of method add product to add the record. Okay. Yes. add product process.html. Oops. I don't think this is the controller. Just a second. Okay, add product. Sorry, add product record.html. It seems. I'm sorry. Add product record.html. Yes. Let me open the database once. I'll add a product record with ID 107. Okay. New record, let's say 107. I20 or something like that. Price. Let's say car. Click on add product. Okay, it says record added successfully. Let's see whether the record is added or not. Oops, it's not added here. Okay, I'm sorry. First of all, I didn't check. Actually, we got this DO right. This is interface. Okay, we want to inject this itself. Select DO. Just a minute. Let this updated. Not 7, I20, price something like this. So click on add product. No, there is some issue just a second. But it's not throwing any exceptions. Also here, everything looks fine. Even we got this message that okay, the transaction advice is applied. Here, this advice which we got. Okay, this attribute, why I have added it, propagation required, means it indicates that we want the transaction, oh sorry, not required, let me do this. Yeah, required is fine. This indicates that we want this method to be executed under the transaction context. By default, it will be required itself, but we can explicitly mention that we want this method to be executed under the transaction context. Okay, we want a transaction. That is what required means over there. Okay, fine. Let's check for this configuration file once. Okay. It is not needed. Order is not important here. It is providing the complete details that, okay, see advisors, which method, add product method. It says it is applying the advice, go to the add product method here. Session factory should be enough, I believe. You can take only session factory, okay? So let's run this code once again. The session factory in turn will be dealing with the data source. No, there's not even an exception here or error or something like that. Going, but just do this. Okay. Session.c, we are marking the product object. We are making sure that this method executes under the transaction. Everything looks normal. Okay. Even actually if there is some issue, you won't get this arrows. If there is some issue with the advice, it won't show you this way. Okay, fine. I'll do one thing. Let's not, waste our time. So let me do one thing. I'll try to fix it, okay, today, and let you know tomorrow what's the problem. But, we are very much close. I believe, there is not much. Might be, if I'm missing somewhere, let me trace it once and let you know, okay. But this is how it is applied. That virus will be applied this way. So there can be a small issue somewhere. If I'm missing something, just let me check that. Okay, today, and I'll let you know tomorrow. And there will be we'll be talking about few things like propagations and all. See the ones which you're looking at here, the propagations, we'll be talking about it. We will conclude the transaction management. We'll start with Spring Security. So that will be our last module. Fine. So I'll stop it here today. Okay, we'll meet tomorrow at same time, and I'll let you know what was the problem. Okay, I'll tell you. Fine.